In this video, we're going to go over 3 of the most common mistakes on our standard 3 test when converting equations to slope-intercept form. So for slope-intercept form, we want to have it in the form of y equals mx plus b, where y is on a side by itself, m is equal to our slope, and b is our y-intercept. This form makes it really easy to graph, and we can quickly graph if we can get our equation into this form. So for our first example, we're going to do the equation 2y plus 3x equals 8. Again, our goal is to get y on a side by itself, so we're going to try to remove everything from this side of the equal sign by using the inverse order of operations. So when we use the inverse order of operations, we have to undo addition and subtraction first. So the first thing we need to do is get rid of this 3x. Right here we see that it's a positive 3x, and so to undo that, we're going to subtract 3x from this side. When we do that, the x's cancel out, and all we have left is 2y. And if we do it to the left side, we have to do it to the right side of our equation. So we're going to subtract 3x over here. We can't subtract 3x from an 8 because they're not like terms, but behind here we don't usually write it, but there is a 0x because 0 times anything is 0. So there would be a plus a 0x. So we can subtract 3x from 0x, and that's going to give us a negative 3x. So on the right side of our equation we have 8 minus 3x. From here we need to undo the multiplication and division, and so we have a 2y, so we're going to divide by 2 to undo that. 2 divided by 2 is 1, and 1 times anything is always the other number, so that leaves us with just a y on the left side, and on our right side we're going to divide by 2. You can choose to divide the entire thing by 2, or you could write it separately as 8 divided by 2 minus 3 divided by 2, and then times your x. Either way, we can simplify, and we're going to get 8 divided by 2 is 4, and then minus 3 halves x. And we're almost in slope-intercept form here. We could graph this, but if we want to write it exactly in this form with y equals mx plus b, we need to rearrange it. And remember that the sign to the left of the number always stays with it. So here this 4 has no sign in front of it, so it's positive. This 3 halves x has a negative sign in front of it, so when we rewrite it, we would rewrite it as y equals negative 3 halves x plus 4. And we can pretty easily graph that because we know that the y-intercept is 4 and it has a slope of negative 3 halves, meaning that it goes down 3 for every 2 that it moves to the right. Alright, for our second example, we're going to do the problem 6x minus 4 equals negative 1/2, and then in parentheses y minus 2. We had a couple problems similar to this on the test, and there are a couple different ways that you can solve, but the most common mistake was made when we tried to use the distributive property first. So I'm going to go through that example there. Using the distributive property is a great way to simplify and get rid of your parentheses, and so I think that's a good strategy, but it's really important to remember that distributing means that we're going to multiply, and when we multiply, if there's a negative, we have to multiply everything inside our parentheses by a negative 1/2. So that's our first step. So on the left side, I'm just going to copy everything down because we're not doing anything on that side yet. Then we're going to take negative 1/2 times y, which would be negative 1/2 y. And also negative 1/2 times this negative 2. When we do that, our negatives are going to cancel out when we multiply. So we're just looking at 1/2 times 2. That would be 2 over 2, which would be 1. And so we have plus 1. Now we're still trying to get y on a side by itself, so we're going to remove everything from this side by using the inverse order of operations, starting with undoing addition and subtraction. So we're going to undo our plus 1 by subtracting 1. We do that from both sides, and we end up with 6x minus 5 equals negative 1/2 y. And our last step here is to undo the multiplication and division. This means negative 1/2 times y, and so we can divide by 1/2. That's also the same as multiplying by a negative 2. So you can think of it either way, but keep in mind that there is a negative here that we need to pay attention to. So I'm going to think of it as multiplying by a negative 2, and so 6 times negative 2 is negative 12x, and then negative 5 times a negative 2 would be positive 10, and then that would just equal y on this side. Okay, really important to keep in mind those negatives there. Again, when you go through to multiply or divide by your negative 1/2, it's going to cancel out, and this is going to become a positive 10. And if we want to rewrite this in the form of y equals mx plus b, we can easily do that, where we write y equals the mx is the negative 12x, and plus b is our plus 10. And then we could graph that part. For our third example, we're going to try to figure out what we need to do when we have a negative y in our equation. So we have 3 minus y equals 5x plus 4. There are two approaches to solve this. I'm going to go through the one that most people had difficulties with and then show you another strategy that you could use to try and solve for y as well. So a lot of people are saying, okay, well, I want to get y by itself on one side, so I need to get rid of this 3. It's a positive 3, so I'm going to subtract 3 from both sides. And that's a great first step, but it leaves us with a negative y. We end up with negative y equals 5x plus 1, which is okay, except we can't graph until we have a positive y. So what you would need to do then is multiply both sides by negative 1. And that's going to switch all of the signs, because a negative 1 times a negative y is going to cancel out, and it'll just become y. Over here, negative 1 times 5x would be a negative 5x, and a negative 1 times 1 would be a negative 1. So this is the final equation we're looking for here. It's in y equals mx plus b form, and you could graph that. Another strategy you could use if you didn't remember that you need to multiply through everything by a negative 1, if we start with that 3 minus y equals 5x plus 4. Right away, if I realize that I'm going to have a negative y and that's going to be an issue, I can add y to both sides, and on the left side it's going to cancel out. If I add it over here, I now have 3 equals 5x plus 4 plus y. This equation looks a little bit long, but at least we have a positive y, and now we can just start to remove everything from this side by undoing addition and subtraction and get to the other side. So if we subtract 4 from both sides, we now have negative 1 equals 5x plus y. And then we subtract 5x from both sides. Now we have negative 5x minus 1 equals y. And that would be the same thing as this equation. This one's just written when y equals mx plus b. Okay. So key ideas here for the mistakes that were made. In problems like number 1 here, our most missed area was that when we went to divide this by 2, we either divided the 8 by 2 or the 3 by 2, and we forgot to do both parts divided by 2. So when you divide from this side to this side, you have to divide both parts by that number. On number 2, the most common mistake here was when distributing, we forgot that a negative times a negative creates a positive, and then a lot of times we had a slope that was going in the wrong direction, or a y-intercept that was either positive when it should have been negative, negative when it should have been positive. And number 3, our most common mistake there was that we weren't able to get this to be a positive y. We just ended with this equation here, and we said, okay, y is going to equal 5x plus 1, but really it's a negative y is going to equal 5x plus 1, so you need to switch all of the signs there to make them positive. Okay, so if you've finished watching this video, then you can go onto the Math Resources website. You can either print a copy of the practice problems or copy them down in your notebook, but you must show your work to get credit for it. Then once you've done all of those practice problems, go ahead and show me, and then you are free to retake the test at any time.